Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final event in the Berkeley Center for New Media's Fandom and Piracy mini-series. My name is Gail DeCosmic, and I'm the director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, which we call BCNM. BCNM is an interdisciplinary research center that studies and shapes media transition and emergence from diverse perspectives. BCNM is committed to promoting technological equity and justice. As such, our free events are inclusive, respectful, and harassment-free spaces. We do not tolerate hate speech or Zoom bombing. We will have a safety team for each event to respond to any disruptive or hateful behavior. Attendees who violate any of the community guidelines stated here will be removed from the event and may be disallowed from future Berkeley Center for New Media online events. Before joining our agreements, please read our community agreements. Before joining our events, please read our community agreements. We will share a link to those in the chat. And we encourage you to explore native-land.ca, our home on native land, to learn about the native stewards of the land you're joining us from. And our first value is to honor the land. We recognize that BCNM is located in the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples, specifically the confederated villages of Lishan. The history of prolific technological development in this region has always depended on this land, and all of our technological infrastructures and activities take place on and in relation to this land. We commit to supporting the sovereignty and ongoing stewardship of this place by Ohlone peoples through building long-term reciprocity and relationships with tribal leaders and organizations. I would also like to honor the Waray peoples of Leyte Island and the Lumad peoples of Mindanao Island in the Philippines, my homeland, and the Tongva peoples of Shuangna, Place of the Rushes, now called Lomita, California, where I grew up, and the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, in whose Aboriginal homeland I now reside in what is called the City and County of San Francisco. And now I'm going to turn to fandom and piracy. The Fandom and Piracy miniseries consists of Professor Rebecca Wanzo's keynote lecture on fandom 3 weeks ago, Professor Kavitha Phillips' keynote lecture on piracy 2 weeks ago, last week's scholars panel on fandom and race, and tonight's scholars panel on piracy and capitalism. A trillion thanks to our amazing Fandom and Piracy staff for working so hard behind the scenes and behind the screens to make this series happen. Lara Wolf, Sophia Hussein, Alicia Morera, Jacqueline Joe, our student moderators, and our captioners. The Fandom and Piracy miniseries platforms the study of new media phenomena through a queer, feminist, and anti-racist lens. Fandom and piracy are two modes of countercultural computing, alternative media, distributed creativity, and copying culture. I wanted to convene tonight's scholars panel on piracy and capitalism because I know these 5 individuals have brilliant thoughts and theories to offer about media distribution and access, the gates around information and entertainment that are being built and destroyed, opened and closed by official and unofficial actors in the network, and as Kavitha Philip asks, who can be a pirate and who does not need to be a pirate? Our 5 amazing panelists are Alexander Dent, Keller Easterling, Jennifer Holt, Brewster Kahl, and Elisa Kelly. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and then they'll speak for between 5 and 12 minutes, and then I'll announce the second speaker, and we'll hear them speak, and so on. After we've heard from all 5 panelists, we'll invite Kavitha Philip, who gave the fabulous keynote lecture on piracy 2 weeks ago, to jump in and offer a response. Then I'll facilitate conversation among the panelists and pose some of your questions to the panelists. And while our panelists give their remarks, please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Our first fantastic speaker tonight is Alexander Dent, who is an associate professor of anthropology and international affairs at George Washington University. Dr. Dent's current research uses digital textuality as a way to critique the violent policing of media piracy and the use of intellectual property laws to curtail participation in global economies. He is also engaged in an analysis of the role of confidence in establishing political and economic authority. Finally, he is focusing on Brazilian punk rock in order to understand the role of music in fostering social change. His last book analyzed the post-authoritarian popularity of Brazilian country music and rodeo as a way to unify theories of performance from linguistic anthropology, media, cultural, and performance studies. Please welcome Alex Dent.
Thank you so much for having me. I was just talking to the group of panelists before coming on the sort of main call that when I first received the invitation to talk about talk in the context of fandom and piracy, I didn't absolutely grok what the connection was between the two things. And after watching the lectures and watching the panelists last week, I can't believe I didn't think of it. So Dr. Ducosnik, thank you for putting those two things together. That was a brilliant stroke. I think it's ironic that I didn't necessarily get the relationship between fandom and piracy, because as I was reflecting back on how I got started being interested in piracy, I came to it through fandom. So back in 1998, I was writing a book about Brazilian country music. Let's not get sidetracked right now. Brazilian country music, and I was trying to determine who was listening to it, who were the fans, where was it popular, and so I was looking at Billboard charts and sort of official kind of licit channels, and I was determining that about 13% of the country listened to country music, the nation's country music. But I was going past this gigantic informal economy every day in downtown Campinas, which is a city northwest of Sao Paulo, about 2.5 million people. And it struck me that tens of thousands of physical units of pirated media were changing hands every day. And there was a strange irony here, because no one was counting this stuff at all. And it didn't seem to me that it would be that difficult to count. You could surely develop a system to figure out who was buying what kinds of genres. So long before this got politicized, when this was, young people with CD burners in their basements, they didn't mind the gringo, as I obviously am and was, coming and hanging around and counting things. And so I did. I hung around and I counted genres. But what I noticed over the course of this period, stretching from 1998 onwards, was that piracy became increasingly politicized. There were these anti-piracy NGOs sprouting like mushrooms after rain. I'm not sure what the rain would be, maybe like neoliberal theology, perhaps. But anyway, they were sprouting all over the place, and they were talking about piracy. And as a practicing musician at the time, at first, I didn't actually know what they were talking about. What is this thing, piracy? I'm not sure I understand it. I was thinking of the naval metaphors, which have actually been written about sort of metaphorically. And so I noticed that there was this bizarre kind of paradox happening. And that's kind of where I want to start tonight, is that I noticed that in this moment, piracy was in one space completely ignored with respect to kind of licit sales. It was ignored by economists as a kind of an activity which was, employing people profitably. It was ignored by economists as, something that makes sense under capitalism. Under capitalism, you create a good and sell it, if you can market it for less, that absolutely makes sense, which I had articulated to me by a whole series of informal sellers. So in this space, it was ignored. In this other space, it was being hyper scrutinized. And so I saw this paradox and I thought, why exactly is this taking place? And so I'll do a shameless plug for the book, and I don't feel bad doing it. So the book that has come out in July, heck of a time to drop a book, is called Digital Pirates on Stanford Press. And I don't feel bad plugging it because it has been pirated. And so if you would like to get a copy, you can find one free of charge. But in that book, I spend a fair bit of time talking about digital textuality. And the argument that I make there is that, I think we get bombarded all the time by how staggeringly new this moment is. And I think, Kavita's talk did a wonderful job of, historicizing that for us last week and saying, hold on a minute, there's a whole lot that's actually been going on for a very, very long time. Thanks for the link. Maybe put the pirated one up there too. I'm just kidding. So this has been, in some sense, around for a long time. But if there are some new things, it strikes me that perhaps the new part of digital textuality is encapsulated by what I talk about in the book as cellularity, reduced response time, transcendence of space, the condensation of communicative modalities into one device, and the portability of that device. That seems newish. Not entirely new, perhaps, but that seems newish. And it creates a whole series, to my mind, of anxieties. I mean, we have these desires about going viral in a positive way. Maybe something I put out there will sort of catch on. That's a positive valence. But on the other side, we have these very, very deep-seated anxieties about what it means for ourselves to spill into spaces. And yes, it's being graphic. Spill into spaces that we don't want ourselves to spill into. So I talk about this a little bit as the digital sublime in the book. As I say, one of the things I noticed in Brazil is that piracy was getting hyper scrutinized at this moment. The other thing that's important to understand that was taking place at this point is that the myth of racial democracy, which Brazil, sort of certainly the right wing, but also the establishment had used in Brazil for many years to kind of tamp down discourses of race and sort of thinking about racial activism was really being undermined during this period. That there was a lot of questioning about the myth of racial democracy in Brazil, and the notion that actually race plays a tremendously important role in how things are policed and apportioned in Brazil. And one of the places that this struck me was in this concept of circulatory legitimacy. When I talk about circulatory legitimacy, I'm talking about when things circulate, making sure that you're paying attention to the rights holder. This is not about authors. IP people will pretend that it's about authors. It's not about authors. It's about signaling attention to the rights holder. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about circulatory legitimacy. And circulatory legitimacy, it strikes me as a way for intellectual property maximalists to kind of manage their anxiety around this sort of the sublime nature of digital textuality. I just want to talk about a couple of things. How's my time? How am I doing?
You're good. Keep going.
Okay. So, one of the things I noticed with respect to circulatory legitimacy was that it was a kind of a pedagogical project, that it required training consumers in the physical qualities of services and objects to think about which objects were bad and which objects were good. And the reason I bring up discourses of race here is that there was explicitly racialized, let's just say racist language being used here. The pirated goods were, in this particular Brazilian context, and of course, we have our own problems in Canada and the United States, so I do not wish to sort of appear to be dumping on Brazil here. But the problem in Brazil was that these racialized discourses were getting employed to talk about what was dirty, what was too mixed, what was promiscuous, in fact, about pirated goods. And so this, of course, gave me pause. And this is one of the things that I'm writing about in the book, is to really try and problematize those racialized discourses. Just a couple of final things to note here. First of all, to close, the money that's been spent on piracy, all the kind of privatization of policing that's happened in Brazil, and it has been privatization. It's been the Motion Picture Association of America, it's been the the Recording Industry Association of America incentivizing local police forces to police intellectual goods. That money has been staggeringly ill spent, because it's been a bit like whacking a ball of mercury. You whack it and it spreads out. And so what it has in fact done to piracy in Brazil is it has rendered it more diffuse and more intimate. Pirates are now occupying these spaces in residential neighborhoods. They're no longer at centralized markets, because these are visually, these draw too much attention. They've kind of spread out into these residential neighborhoods. One of the things that I was at pains to think about in the book was the nature of policing, because my sort of friends were, folks from copyleft, folks from Creative Commons, and there was this belief there that the information wants to be free, which I think is a beautiful concept. I think there's some problems with it. But what I wanted to steer us away from was thinking about the policing of piracy as purely being about the taking of bribes. I think one simple explanation here is that the international policing sort of organizations, the intellectual property maximalists, are incentivizing people purely through money. And it was by way of these kinds of racialized discourses and these anxieties about genres mixing, things mixing too much. And, I would use these if I did that often, but, too much mixture was what was being policed here. My whole point here was that policing had some deeply kind of local roots to it that I definitely wanted to attend to. The last thing I will just say quickly is that for years, as I've been writing this piracy book, doing these articles and giving talks on piracy, I've asked my audiences, where do you pirate? What do you pirate? How do you pirate? And I noticed about 4 or 5 years ago that those numbers started to go down, that there weren't as many people pirating things. And I'm here to say that piracy is very much back in the digital space. And I think what was diminishing a little bit was some of the kind of materiality of it. But now, I'm not sure if The Mandalorian was the start of it, but all of these streaming services seeking to monetize these different pieces of content have really brought piracy back into the discussions that I'm having with my students in the classroom again. So this continues to be a very, very timely topic. And the fact that the materiality of the goods is maybe shifting a little bit is not going to diminish the importance of our ongoing treatment of this. Bloviation done.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. More bloviation is always welcome on this topic. Okay, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Keller Easterling. Keller Easterling is an architect, writer, and the Enid Storm Dwyer Professor of Architecture at Yale. Her most recent book, Medium Design, Knowing How to Work on the World, from Verso in 2021, inverts an emphasis on object and figure to prompt innovative thought about both spatial and non-spatial problems. Another recent book, Extra Statecraft, The Power of Infrastructure Space, from Verso in 2014, examines global infrastructure as a medium of polity. Keller Easterling is a 2019 United States Artist Fellow in Architecture and Design. She was also the recipient of the 2019 Blueprint Award for Critical Thinking. Her Many, M-A-N-Y project, an online platform facilitating migration through an exchange of needs, was exhibited at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale. Her research and writing on the floor comprised one of the elements in Rem Koolhaas's Elements exhibition for the 2014 Venice Biennale. Please take it away, Keller Easterling.
Thank you, Gail. And thank you so, I mean, I'm just echoing what everybody else has said. Thank you so much for this series. I really enjoyed it and learned so much from everyone here. Great admirer of all of you all. And you all, it seems, have been, talking about piracy as a spectrum of characters and practices and organizations that all have very different dispositions, very different constitutions or temperaments or propensities. There are violent criminals as well as agents to power, like the mercenaries or the corsairs with the Queen's letter of marque. There are shadow figures or doubles, petty thieves, dropouts. When I started studying piracy a couple of decades ago now, the old pirate belts of centuries before were alive again. Pirates, now kind of equipped with GPS, were back in the water and preying on the huge container ships of globalizing trade. But they were moving between entrepôts that were stabilizing a form of smuggling or theft at the center of power. They were entrepôts that were the free zone enclaves of exception, exempt from taxes and labor or environmental regulation, and all wrapped up in shiny skylines and promoted as world cities. These were the centers of lawlessness and corporate externalizing, the engine rooms of neoliberalism that found a way to reinforce their closed loops and echo chambers so that the house always wins and always against labor. They embody an extreme form of violence with no single criminal event, inoculated against contradiction. They enact the violence of remaining intact. And maybe this free zone is just a really graphic urban precipitate of a more generalized human condition, a primitive quest for bounded worlds and utopias and monocultures, all ideally parsed with an elementary particle or a universal subject. Enemies are singular, solutions are comprehensive. So maybe on the more productive end of the pirate spectrum, piracy is an organizational agent that interferes with the closed loop and its circulation of conforming, compatible material. To make its interference with that circulation to make organizations more information rich. Piracy breaks the blockade. Piracy is the error or contradiction or difference that makes a difference, Bateson's definition of information, or it's the inadmissible evidence, the dissensus that breaks consensus for someone like Rancière. It's the logic knot of feminist and abolitionist perspectives. but maybe more importantly, the productive piracy is mixing species of information. And it's the movement between realms, or the passage through trapdoors from one to the next, that is information rich. And maybe the organization that is more information rich is also dispositionally, temperamentally less violent. You can assess the dispositions of piracy to see where the loop is being broken and where it's being tightened. And declarations and ideological labels and technological capacities aren't really reliable markers of this underlying disposition. And there's no steady state. What is ideologically radical can be dispositionally conservative. A sophisticated technology or space can be dispositionally and temperamentally crude. So, digital environments encourage the explosive creation of fandom and provide camouflage and disguise for shape-shifting bodies that, as Elisa Kelly says, can slip away. But when that information-rich exchange is filtered through dumb binaries of likes and dislikes, it can become information poor, with blunt divides and trolls and fans that conform to being followers. The label or declaration can decouple from the disposition or the temperament, so that piracy breaks the copyright and many other laws to put more information on the table. Productive piracy as riot and sabotage is sometimes even the relatively gentle act if it breaks up the sustained and overwhelming violence of things like corporate fossil fuels, or the free zones I was talking about, near monopolies of data, or monolithic policing. But if piracy is the act of mixing, and because I work on space, I would say this, if piracy is the act of mixing, it also productively mixes digital and heavy information. The heavy solids in space are information. So, digitally reliant smart cities are dispositionally dumb as they recenter information, or Ethereum may only be another of these centralizing elementary particles. But Tor networks switching through physical public libraries in New Hampshire are potentially more complex and robust. Piracy mixes different forms of values, collectivity, and exchange. So just like you wait for the copyrights to expire, design piracy, like what I would be talking about, exploits the abundant failures of capital. Not just bankruptcy, foreclosure, eviction, but failures to nourish and stabilize against gentrification and dispossession. And as space falls off abstract financial ledgers like property, it can be decommodified and mixed in networks of heavy spatial values, what C.K. Gibson Graham calls community economies, the rich mutualism and resistance that Miriam Makaba and so many others exercise at the heart of abolitionist thought. So maybe heterogeneous, lumpy, colloidal, human, non-human pirate cocktails have a better chance of outwitting capital. Sometimes I think that's hardest to swallow for some is that piracy is impure and maybe sneaky. Making things less violent and more information rich often doesn't conform to dogma of a white ass modern Enlightenment mind. And finally, these loops and their walls and knobby clubs and mothballed utopias and modern toupees often hold out a dream of something called freedom, where the manifesto will be unleashed and the chains will fall away. But in organizations encouraged to form loops and walls, the freedom of one can only exist at the expense of another. And so, maybe there's no realm of liberation, but only a process of piracy. Maybe no hypocritical freedom, but rather a release into entanglement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keller. I was sorry for the pause. I was like just typing out release into entanglement when you finished, and now I have to thank you so much and introduce our next amazing speaker. Okay, so this next phenomenal person is one of my great friends, Jennifer Holt. Jen is Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a fellow with the Center for Democracy and Technology in Washington, D.C. She's a super fan of the Chicago Cubs and Bruce Springsteen, and her interest in piracy goes all the way back to its role in the origins of universal jurisdiction. She's the author of Empires of Entertainment and co-editor of Distribution Revolution, Connected Viewing, Selling, Streaming, and Sharing Media in the Digital Age, and Media Industries, History, Theory, Method. Her current book project, Cloud Policy, Deregulating Digital Freedom, is a legal and cultural history of digital media infrastructure policy related to pipelines, platforms, and data. Thank you for joining us, Jen. Take it away.
Thank you, Gail. I really want to thank you and your amazing team for this invitation and for keeping us going, keeping our scholarly community going in these times when it is so hard to do that. So this has been really a fun series to watch, and I'm really glad you guys have put in all the hard work to put it together. I don't usually focus on piracy, but I do write about law and policy as it relates to digital media. So the concept of piracy is always really relevant and present in the main areas I write and think about. And when I got this invitation, I was talking to a Navy lawyer for the cloud policy book that I'm writing, and I was thinking about the data centers that are being placed under the sea and what that meant for data jurisdiction. Who controls data when it's dropped into the ocean to be stored offshore as opposed to being tethered to geographically determined territorial-based laws of jurisdiction and sovereignty. And in our discussion, we talked about the concept of universal jurisdiction, the exercise of legal authority that allows governments to prosecute people for the most heinous crimes: torture, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. And even if the perpetrator or the victim or the crime itself occurred somewhere else. And universal jurisdiction has its origins in the prosecution of pirates and piracy, and then ultimately the slave trade. But piracy, the crimes against people and property on the high seas, gave birth to it. And the idea being that it, some crimes are so heinous to the international order that the perpetrators should find no sanctuary for them anywhere. And it was designed to go after hostis humani generis, the enemies of all mankind. And I'm thinking, so this, piracy, this is the term we're using for the unsanctioned use of intellectual property. How incredibly offensive and insulting to the amazing concept of universal jurisdiction. And as I'm having these thoughts, I get Gail's email, and I obey Gail no matter what. But it seemed kind of wild that her request arrived just as I was thinking about this term, and it's linked to data under the sea. So here I am. And I thought I'd use my participation as a way to bring in the discourse and framing around piracy and have some conversation about that. And thinking about that has sent me down some serious rabbit holes, and including some great 19th century court cases, Supreme Court cases about piracy, and the writing of Marcus Rediker on the golden age of piracy in the 17th and 18th century, and the the work of Adrian Johns, who argued, to assume that piracy merely derives from legal doctrine is to get the history and therefore the politics and much else besides back to front. Johns brings us all the way back to ancient Rome, where the term was formalized into law and the use of ships became incidental to the status of pirates being the enemies of humankind in general. In fact, land-based criminals with no allegiance to legitimate authority were viewed as pirates too, which made me think of a lot of professors and made me laugh, but I'm gonna keep going. So Johns tracks the use of the term, which unfortunately we've all come to accept and even apply to our own behavior, thus reinforcing the extremely loaded politics and embedded power dynamics in this historical concept. And as Tarleton Gillespie wrote in his book, Wired Shut, the acceptance of terms like pirate is also an acceptance of its implicit assertions about right and wrong, of what the internet should be for, of what ends copyright should serve, and I would add for whom the data is intended. And so when thinking about this and our data under the sea being stored by big tech giants such as Microsoft's Project Natick off the coast of Scotland, I've come to believe we're in a new golden age of piracy, but the people without a nation are now corporations who have very specific geographically bound corporate headquarters, but have managed to find ways to plunder our own data and profit off of it on the high seas as well as on land, all while escaping the version of universal jurisdictions that's in their terms of service agreements, which are reserved for pirates like you and me. So as this conference has stated as a goal to look at the long and troubled history of piracy's relationship to capitalist frameworks of ownership, authorship, access, infrastructure, sharing, and saving, nowhere does that seem more relevant to me than the role of big tech and the exploitation of their users' data for financial gain. This relationship certainly speaks to issues of infrastructure and sovereignty raised in the really great keynote talk by Kavita Phillip, and how big tech is now reformulating our frameworks of ownership and access, etc., through the infrastructure they control. As I see it, they are the true pirates and the new sovereigns. It reminds me of the Bob Dylan lyric, steal a little and they throw you in jail, steal a lot and they make you a king. And of course, the government's reliance on big tech is central to this framing and its ultimate surrender of state control over to private power. There were actually hearings in the 1960s about a national data center proposed by President Johnson that were about the threats to privacy posed by the computer and government control of data. And these hearings were really the true high watermark for the US government's concern about the privacy of its citizens in the face of technological advance. The overwhelming expressions of concern about, government and law enforcement's usage of computerized data and its threat to the sanctity of individual privacy and civil liberties would never again uniformly be heard in the halls of Congress. Interestingly, the focus on government control of data blinded the legislators to the ensuing problems that were created by the alternative, which was putting data in the hands of corporations. And to his credit, Senator Long, who presided over these hearings, did warn that if the proposals for a national data bank in 1966 and 67 concerned themselves only with government interests, and if individual private interests were ignored, we might be creating a form of Frankenstein's monster. But his words went unheeded, and sadly, history would prove him right. And of course, we can't forget that 70% of the intelligence budget, the US federal intelligence budget, has been historically spent on partnerships with private corporations for data collection and enforcement. And really, the government relies on corporate funding and development for the cloud to function at all. The three largest cloud providers in the world, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, have spent billions and billions of dollars on data centers and related infrastructure. And after all of this, what we've ended up with is Mark Zuckerberg's proclamation that, quote, privacy is no longer a social norm. And that has become true. The destruction of this individual right was a joint effort of the government and big tech, abetted by our own cultural dependence on all that mobile, social, and digital media have to offer. But in reality, the death of our privacy is the work of big tech's data piracy. So I'm really interested that we start flipping the script and talking about how we are being subject to piracy every single day. Shoshana Zuboff, in her phenomenal tour de force, Surveillance Capitalism, has definitely done a lot to contribute to that effort, arguing that the road to our current predicament is littered with terms such as the open internet and connectivity being, quote, quietly harnessed to a market process in which individuals are definitely cast as the means to others' market ends. And in this process, I would also include how our students, just in the act of trying to attend lectures and classes, now are being turned into commodities, as we all are at the university, while we have worked so hard to function online this past year. So I would argue we need to begin reframing the discussion of piracy and better identify the true enemies of mankind in the digital era, so we can start rehabilitating our civil liberties and reclaiming what rightfully belongs to us, which is our data. And I'll leave it there for now, and we'll talk more in the Q&A.
Yes, Jen, thank you. All right, our next superstar speaker has asked me to do a very, very short bio for him. So that's what I will do. Brewster Kahl is a passionate advocate for public internet access and a successful entrepreneur. He has spent his career intent on a singular focus, providing universal access to all knowledge. He is the founder and digital librarian of the Internet Archive, one of the largest libraries in the world. Brewster, I hope that was short enough. Please share your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you very much, Gail. This is completely fun. And hello from Squamish Nation in North Vancouver. So it's actually, I'm on Squamish Nation land. So the Internet Archive, I've been, archiving the internet for a long time now. Share my screen here. And it's sort of the land of what a lot of people call fandom or piracy. And I've been around for long enough now that I've seen the change in what people refer to in this whole area. So I guess with living in the internet era, you can sort of see cycles really fast. And when this concept of fandom and piracy came up, it was just great. I mean, like, okay, let's really think about that word. But I don't think actually the interesting is the word, it's who says it. And what do they mean by it? What are they trying to do by use the word fandom? When I think of fandom, I think of, I don't know, Trekkies, right? So people that go and dress up and they're amateurs and they're giving cultural references, but they're creative works. They're doing things that are very creative and interesting, but there's often this kind of diminutive sort of, it's just fandom. It's like, okay, what do they mean by that? And so I've been trying to think a bit more, especially in the internet era, what are some of the things that we've had for fandom? So I'm going to play a short clip from a video by Todd Haynes, now a famous director, that was referring to Karen Carpenter and anorexia. And the creative thing during this student era film is he used Barbie dolls.
Stop, Dave. Karen, are you all right?
I'm sorry, Richard. God damn, I'm really flubbing it up today, aren't I? I'm sorry, guys.
Don't worry about it, Dave.
I don't know what's the matter with me.
Just relax. Take a deep breath. Look, we'll just do it until it's right. You just do what I tell you and it'll be great.
Oh, I just wanted to be perfect.
Why
So there's Todd Haynes, famous director to be, using these cultural things. Okay, cultural references and amateur. Is that really the right definition of fandom? I think if sometimes people get called amateur, it used to be vanity press, right? Now it's self-published. But it just means that you don't have, well, a phalanx of lawyers to go and do your bidding. In many of these circumstances, the impact can be often greater by these works on the general culture, and the creativity higher, even though it's diminutively called by some fandom. This is a that is a video clip. I highly recommend the rest of it, by Nina Paley, who got crushed in copyright wars of trying to get some work of hers out that uses a 78 RPM record, and she couldn't get it for reasonable fees, and so she just went on a copy fight, and realized that, well, all art is derivative. It's all built on other things. I helped sponsor an exhibit called the Illegal Art Exhibit, put together by Carrie McLaren a number of years ago, of court order banned works. And she made an exhibit and hung it in a gallery in New York at CBGB Galleries, and then also went on to go and do DVDs and CDs of court order banned works, sort of somewhat in the area of piracy, you'd say, for the but also in these cultural references that are really not appreciated by those in power. And these are some of the works that were exhibited at that time. So, okay, but I archive the web. So it gives me kind of a view on sort of what's been going on. And what I love about my job is I love the dreamers. I like the people that are trying new and different things. They're almost always whacked one way or another for trying something new, but I love the dreamers. And that, I think, is probably a better framing than fandom and piracy. So some of the early internet fandom, a lot of the things that were put up often had cultural references, but they became things on and of themselves. They became the new normal that was exploited later by publishers with money and lawyers, and therefore came out of fandom and suddenly became professional. But how different is it really in terms of what these things were? So a few pieces on the sort of whole fandom thing. Let's take piracy. Piracy. Who says it and why? And does the meaning shift over time as power shifts? And you bet it does. There's a really fun, I mean, a whole lot less scholarly than the other people on this panel, but a really good documentary series called The Lost Pirate Kingdom. And it's #1 in Canada. I've been watching it over the last week. And it is about the golden age of piracy, and where pirates came from in the Caribbean, where they were privateers with letters of marque. They were mentioned earlier in this talk. And they basically were privateers with a monarch. And then if you didn't have a monarch behind you, then you were a pirate. And I just wonder if at that time, even if you were attacked by a privateer, you might call them a pirate. It's basically, pirate is a way of saying you're not right to come and attack my thing. So anyway, helpful for me to try to reframe, how did people think of it? And it was not a disorganized act in terms of how these folks went about what they did, and they were often somewhat sanctioned. Then really in the whole area of the internet wars, of copyright wars throughout the internet, I just love these sort of home taping is killing music. It's like, is it really? I mean, did that really kill music? And you look back on some of these things and They're just not right at all. Okay, maybe there were mixtapes, which are kind of awesome, and maybe that helped hip hop come about and then get exploited. Then suddenly that's not piracy. So I think we can get a little bit of a history, often compressed, that they were just wrong, and they just throw these words out to try to undermine others. This is a clip from Don't Copy That Floppy.
Now I know you love the gigs, and that's all right to do, because the posse who makes them, they love them too. But if you start stealing it, the more they can do. Then he'll make one, and she'll make one, and where will it end? One leads to another, more, and no one buys anything more. So no one gets paid, and they can't make more. The posse breaks up and then pulls the store. Don't copy that floppy. So let me break this down for you. Don't.
So, okay, so let's talk about software piracy. So there used to be an organization called the Software Publishers Association, because there used to be an industry of software publishers. And it was actually a big industry. And they spent all of their time and money going and saying, hey, kids are going and stealing our software. That's causing real problems. Well, turns out that wasn't what was really causing problems. It was another of their members, Microsoft, controlled the underlying platform that ate the software industry from below. And if somebody controls the rails, you don't have a real business. If somebody controls how much you pay, how much you can charge, and who you can sell it to, you don't have a company, you have a division. And so that's kind of what happened to software. And it was, but the Software Publishing Association, which doesn't actually exist anymore, is because there's really no software publishing industry anymore on their watch, was undermined. So I've been seeing some of this cycle over and over again. Richard Stallman, when we were back at MIT, we got very frustrated because of the list machine operating system was declared property by MIT, therefore it could be sold. It was sold to Symbolics, and this group act by hundreds and hundreds of us was suddenly going to go down the toilet because it was privatized. And Richard Stallman tried to stop that and couldn't, and therefore went off to make a new operating system, actually an old operating system with a different license. And he came up with this idea of the public license, which is completely clever, jujitsu on things. But it was definitely called piracy at the time. Linus Torvalds and Linux, and this was built on the sort of free and open source software ideas. And it just may be a little hard to remember that this was called horrible and cancer and poison and all things by none other than Steve Ballmer of Microsoft when he was CEO of Microsoft. So in 2001, he publicly called Linux a cancer, and it was just horrible. And it's going to destroy capitalism. And did any of that happen? It's like, no. And so later, this is a piece from 2016. He now loves it now that he's not in charge of Microsoft anymore. And actually, Microsoft has come to use open source software and develop it and help it along, and suddenly it's not a cancer or piracy anymore. And then it comes around to libraries. I run a library, and the head of the Association of American Publishers love to call librarians pirates back in the old days, and now actually the head of the Authors Guild has gone called librarians communists. So it's just not in a positive way. And so these are sort of you can even try to take back practices like library practices. What libraries do is they buy, preserve, and lend materials. That's what they do. And actually in these era of licenses, the publishers are saying that libraries cannot buy books. They cannot preserve them unless they're in the contract. And exactly what does that mean? And they can't lend them. So we're starting to see corporations start to become ever stronger and try to take away basic services like how libraries work. So the Google Books project was one that was called piracy, but The judge did not agree. And of course, it's gone on to be used, and it doesn't seem to have crushed the book industry out of existence at all. So let's think about some of the other things that have been thrown. The privacy word has been thrown at it. And the question is why were they and who was saying it? So YouTube as piracy, you don't hear that anymore, but has YouTube changed that much? Yes, it may be saying some things back, but to publishers based on some royalties, but basically it just became very powerful. BitTorrent. Think about Bitcoin and how is it being referred to, and it's actually being now championed as innovation. It's not piracy anymore, it's innovation. And so we'll see that same kind of shift in things like the decentralized web that are starting to come about. So for me, fandom and piracy, and the idea of this conference I thought was really helpful for me to try to figure out who says it. What do they mean by it? Is it accurate or is it dismissive of what they're saying? And usually what I think is most interesting is that Barbra Streisand effect. It's actually a time to really pay attention to what is being thrown stones at, because it may actually be the next big thing. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Brewster. And now it is my honor to introduce our fifth and final speaker before Kavita joins us for discussion. Our fifth speaker is Elisa Kelly. Elisa is a PhD candidate in the English department at Columbia University. Her research examines how Black spatial and geographic production is archived in art and literature. She thinks about piracy in relation to Black cultural production and preservation, regimes of property, and anti-capitalist modes of circulation. Elisa has a special relationship to fandom as a Mariah Carey scholar and honorary lamb. Thank you so much for joining us, Elisa. Please bring us home.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm not going to be talking about Mariah, but maybe in Q&A we can talk about Mariah. Thank you so much also for the invitation. And it was, such a pleasure to hear all of these amazing talks. And so I know like nothing about digital piracy. So I'm not really going to talk about the internet very much, which I think the other brilliant panelists have done so beautifully already. So I'll just give some kind of scattered, meandering thoughts and ask lots of questions, and hopefully we can have a conversation. Okay, so before we went on strike this past Monday, I was in the middle of teaching found poems by Black women who ransacked colonial archives to take back their violated dead. Through acts of rearrangement and reassembly, the poems attempt to make something else, something nourishing and restorative with these remains. These poets turn stealing into an act of care, grave robbers with golden shovels, or pirates on the slave ship Ghost Ship, spiriting contraband, making off with the inventory, emptying the cargo holds. When the African rebels were caught in Long Island after their revolt aboard the Amistad, they were charged with murder and piracy. In other words, they were charged with stealing themselves and the other enslaved, the goods stowed on the ship. So this raises potentially, for me, a sort of existential question, which is sort of, can you pirate yourself? And given this history, sort of what is the genealogy of the Black pirate in the New World? Since I work on African-American literature, I'm particularly interested in the genealogy of the Black pirate in the United States, where the face of Black pirates are always foreign Black people, distant enemies invoked to sort of shore up constructions of US nationalism and convert piracy to a phenomenon that's sort of outside of the nation state. But long before this, we had the Amistad. So in the context of slavery's history, I suspect that a notion of Black piracy constitutes a kind of double negative, right? Two words that cancel each other out, leaving behind a sort of redaction, where Black people have historically been possessions and pirates have been forces of dispossession. So the Black pirate is this sort of possession that dispossesses the possessor of itself or its own value. It would be the treasure stealing itself, right? And you can steal yourself. The reflexive form of the verb to steal is to withdraw or convey clandestinely, right? To steal away. To be a fugitive is to steal yourself from the plantation, to escape, and to rob the master of your labor and earning capacity. So to steal yourself as a commodity and to steal yourself to run away. These two definitions are imbricated in the Black fugitive's person, both person and possession, both pirate and pirated. During the Civil War, enslaved people who escaped or were transported over Union lines were referred to as contraband of war, which Du Bois describes as property belonging to the enemy and valuable to the invader. So kind of like ontology of the pirated. I think we talk a lot about the pirate and not as much maybe about the pirated, the resistant object perhaps of the pirated, to borrow from Fred Moten. After all, as Du Bois reminds us, contraband were not passive goods, but military laborers and spies, laborers on the plantations where crops went to help the federal army or were sold north. Contraband were strategic objects for the North at the same time that they were subjects, agents of their own emancipation. But there's also this matter of stealing things. So for the slave, Frederick Douglass contends stealing is a moral imperative and a customary right. The morality of free society, Douglass writes, can have no application to slave society. Slaveholders have made it almost impossible for the slave to commit any crime. If he steals, he takes his own. So Douglass argues that if he steals meat from his master, it is not transferred to anyone else's ownership, since as he owns the meat, so he owns Douglass, right? So the meat has changed its physical position and its chemical composition by being eaten, but it remains the property of the master. Fred Moten and Stephen Harney rightly advise us to steal from the university. So stealing, sort of like Douglass, as an ethical imperative, a political aspiration, the breaking up of the university and the redistribution of its parts. To steal from the university is to begin this process without the sanction of the state. Not only is stealing understood as a practice of everyday resistance and an informal mode of regulation, but it has also always been understood as the primary method of the state itself. So enclosure in England, expropriation, westward expansion, forced migration of the slave trade, capitalism's mode of generating profit, the stolen land that many of us inhabit, all of these things are understood by the exploited to be modes of stealing, of state-sanctioned stealing. In contrast to this, the pirate is figured as a sort of vigilante or Robin Hood figure, maybe, who steals for their own personal interest, or even steals for good, right? Who steals from the mega corporations, the giant ships, right? The colonial museums, the big house. And I want to bring up looting here quickly, because looting is also this kind of vigilante figuration, but it connotes a collective, a mob, a swarm. Looters come in a group. They're not individual actors or Robin Hoods. Looting is also very analog. We don't see an internet or a digital equivalent, really. Looting is done with the body. It's done in the dark. Glass usually has to break and something's on fire, right? It's very material. It's associated with riots, natural disasters, blackouts, and blackness. Looting is bad and looting is Black. Of course, this all raises questions about the racial character of the distinctions between piracy, stealing, robbing, redistribution, regulation, looting, appropriation, enclosure, expropriation, reclaiming, reparation, right? So I'm really interested in Kavita Phillips' question of who can be a pirate, right? Of good pirates versus bad pirates, and how these distinctions are attached to race, class, ethnicity, gender, nationality, etc. And of course, to how the figure of the thief or the looter has been weaponized to fuel mass incarceration, racial violence, anti-Black stereotypes, etc. I'm particularly interested in how this haphazard genealogy of Black piracy that I've gestured to appears in Black aesthetic practices. In Black art across medium, we see a formal interest in the remix, the quilt, the collage, the found poem. I've thought a lot about the work of Arthur Jafa, which sort of sits at the intersection, I think, of some of these concerns. Love is the Message is Death from 2016 is his most well-known video work. It's a 7-minute sort of collage of original and found footage, scraped mostly from YouTube and set to a version of Kanye West's Ultralight Beam, which was also pirated. It was actually composed by AJ of several different live and studio versions of the song that were sort of layered together and stitched together. The video clips themselves are arranged by a logic of resonance. Their content is Black life, both its everyday violence and its everyday beauty, and its form is also Black. It moves in Black ways, it follows Black modes of arrangement, improvisation, rhythm, and perhaps instantiates a mode of Black piracy. Initially, the film was just something that AJ made for himself. So he hadn't considered licensing or copyright either for the video clips or for the audio. The clips were short enough to be considered fair use. And for the audio, he actually got Kanye to watch the film and let him use the song. So we have this kind of transformation where the pirated is converted into a sort of legal status through like the alchemy of art and more specifically, the transformative capital of the art world. The pirated pieces gain this sort of formal yet burdened citizenship. During the uprisings last summer, 13 of the institutions that owned Love is the Message participated in a 48-hour continuous broadcast of the film. I spoke then about how the broadcast almost constituted a sort of liberation of the film from the enclosures of private property, since of course the moment the broadcast began, it was the same moment that it would be pirated, devaluing its ostensible art market valuation and, more interestingly, I think, returning it to the very conditions of its production, YouTube and WorldStar and Vimeo videos circulating in the online public. And here I'm reminded of Keller Easterling's formulation, right? A release into entanglement. Aria Dean wrote this really great piece a few years ago that I return to often called Poor Meme, Rich Meme. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll try to go quickly. And in it, she observes, the internet is a prime condition for Black culture to thrive. She cites the British Afrofuturists for whom, quote, the African diaspora prefigures digital networks and its effects on bodies and subjectivities. That Blackness, quote, was always already a networked culture and always already dematerialized thanks to the Middle Passage. Dean also cites Cedric Robinson's formulation of the ontological totality, or the collective being of Blackness. Dean writes, historically, our collective being has always been scattered, stretched across continents and bodies of water. And this is not, to me, not only the figuration of a network, but also speaks to circulation. And Dean is talking about memes and videos of Black death and violence that circulate. In 2021, we can apply this to the circulation of Black dances on TikTok, or of the videos of Black athletes that are sold and traded as NFTs on NBA Top Shot. Of course, underwriting all of this is a historical circulation. From the Middle Passage onward, Dean writes, we have been in circulation, shipped as goods to the New World, circulated through the Americas as labor, circulating ourselves as fugitives. And here, Dean points us to something perhaps more difficult to talk about. When we imagine piracy's genealogy at sea, then the position of Black people is in the hold of the ship, is cargo, is contraband, is a thing to be pirated. As Black images, Black audiovisual substance, Black culture, and Black life circulates endlessly as a valuable commodity on the high seas of the internet, so it underwrites the subjectivity of the pirate, continually replenishing its stock. Blackness both sustains and potentially disrupts piracy and its identifiable praxis. So the question I will end with, I guess, is what can we learn from Black piracy? Thank you.
Elisa, if I could give you a standing ovation, I would do it right now. Thank you for that genealogy of Black piracy. What a great, phenomenal, work of art and genius to end the panelist remarks on. And now I would like to invite in our marvelous keynote speaker on piracy from a couple of weeks ago, Professor Kavita Philip. I gave her a long introduction during her keynote lecture, so I will give her a short introduction today. Kavita holds the President's Excellence Chair in Network Cultures at the University of British Columbia, where she is Professor of English and Geography. And I'm going to invite all our panelists to unmute your video and just be on screen for Kavita, as I'm sure she's going to address some of your remarks in her response.
Well, I just want to give literally a standing ovation to all of you and thank you. And my question is, what can we learn from, echoing Elisa's final question, and what can we learn from these incredibly rich readings and riffing and ripping off from the histories of piracy? In the interest of time, I have two categories of questions that I want to address to the whole panel. And they're, one, the histories of race, punishment, and policing. And here I'm drawing not only from what we've heard now, but resonances I heard in all of your work. Judith Butler's notion of the constitutive outside resonated throughout these talks. When we think of whether piracy is inside or outside, we often use the language of contradiction. Is it inside? Is it outside? And how can we find kind of hypocritical symptoms in corporate discourse that help us see what they're getting wrong? And while I share that desire to point out the outrageous hypocrisy of both corporate piracy, theft, and the policing of piracy, I want us to think about how that which is marked outside is often already inside. As an example, I'll point to Bill Gates, who said in the late 90s, I want the Chinese to pirate Microsoft Word because that will increase my sales. And a scant 5 years later, he was on the cover of Forbes saying, I am chasing down Chinese pirates in this incredibly racialized, orientalized view of the pirate dragon behind him. And I call that up because today, as the country listens to the outrageous excuses for the Atlanta murders, we hear that Orientalism isn't really racism, right? So I want to bring up all of the work that's been done on race and punishment, but bring it really to focus in the way that Elisa enjoined us to think about what racialized bodies do for us as we think about piracy. What are we reminded to be careful of? And here to go through the resonances I heard very quickly, Alex briefly talked about the racialized discourses of the promiscuous, dirty Brazilian pirate. I'd love to hear more of that. Keller Easterling, in that incredibly poetic instigation to think about the resistant voices of piracy, enjoined us to look at the resistance spaces within capitalism, invoking J.K. Gibson Graham and the ways in which we have often misunderstood capitalism. And there I want to pause and think what the language of capitalism as purity, uniformity, and domination does for our imaginations of resistance. So 2 questions embedded there. Where is race and resistance in this story? And do we risk romanticizing the ways in which we've always been able to resist in the interstices of capitalism, yet get absorbed into capitalism's consumption of our resistance? Right? And I'll come back to that if that's complicated. But secondly, this is linked to Keller's publications on what activists should do, why it's dangerous for activists to misunderstand how we act in this moment. So if my first set of questions is about the histories of race, policing, and punishment, my second set of questions are about the futures of activism. And there again, I'm inspired by the point on which Elisa ended, and that is disaster. You invoke disasters and crises and natural disasters in reminding us that looting is always an embodied practice. And I want to stay with that image of disaster, and specifically disaster capitalism, to think of us all as living within the disaster of advanced capital. Right? And to think of how we are enjoined to act not only to survive as embodied practitioners of life and sharing and exchange and joy, but also the ways in which our resistance often plays into older models of capitalism and resistance. So certainly if colonial capital was once this steamroller that steamrolled over difference and diversity in the world, what capitalism does today is feed on difference and diversity. And so how do we not only continue to pursue those moments of joy in our diverse consumptive practices that we call fandom, but recognize the ways in which that feeds the ongoing monster of crisis-ridden disaster capital? To review a couple of things there, and just to cite thinkers that have inspired you in these discussions, as well as me, I want to echo Elisa's citing of Cedric Robinson, who reminded us that race wasn't just something outside of capital, that racism wasn't just an aberration, but in fact, the racialization of capital always revived capital by absorbing the resistance, by absorbing the revolt, and by promising to bring freedom exactly to those people who called for a redemption or a correction of their exploited state. So Cedric Robinson reminded us that racial capitalism both uses racisms of yesteryear and also claims a purity to its future in supposedly alleviating or ameliorating the injuries that are claimed in resistance to capital. And I'm using injury there, referring back to Rebecca Wanzo's keynote, where she enjoined us to think about fandom through injury and not just through love. On that note of love, I want to go to Brewster's invocation of the amateur, which of course is rooted in the Latin or Italian amare, which is to love. Which links us nicely with piracy and fandom by reminding us that much of what we do is done through love. Love of Mariah Carey, love of country music with Alex Dent, Bob Dylan with Jennifer Holt. And I also want to remind us that feminists are talking about the ways in which love and care are now feeding the new platform economies of capitalism. The Uber driver who has to have scent and water for you just so you love your ride, the right kind of music, because if you don't love your ride and feel cared for, their scores are going down, they're not getting the full tip that they're deserved, and there's ways in which platform capitalism feeds on love and care, things that have been feminized and racialized practices under capitalism, but that now come to define all kinds of work in platform capital, right? So how are our practices of love that we brought to piracy and fandom in previous cycles of capital? As Brewster reminded us, cycles move really fast in the internet era, right? How are our practices of love and care so so lovingly developed along the lines which Keller was enjoining us to think about. How are these the fodder for the new cycles of disaster capital? So I'll end there, but I'm happy to jump in at any time.
Thank you so much, Kavita. I invite anybody to jump in. I'll just say quickly that Keller's work on alternative activisms, on activists that don't position themselves as pure. Keller also mentioned that in her talk just now, that there's a way that we can imagine being activists that is contingent, that is entangled, as Keller said, that isn't about sort of declaring a manifesto of the path that the revolutionary, and honest and simple and pure path towards progress, towards freedom, towards finally overthrowing oppression once and for all, but activism that is more in the moment, that is more responsive, that is more like con artistry, that is along the lines of the examples that Elisa gave about the slave stealing from the master, taking a book off the shelf when unwatched, or taking a bit of the meat out of the kitchen unsupervised, that these sorts of, Foucault might call them micro-political resistances, but I've been thinking about that in relation to Keller's idea of the new activism. And I actually think piracy is not micro-political at all. It's massive, it's global. Alex likes to count piracy, and so do I. Kavita referenced a data science project that my husband and I have had going on for 3 years that literally counts the number of downloads all over the world of any film or media text. And as Alex said, piracy is not going down, not at all. It's thriving and on the rise and in the millions every time for every text. And so it's not micro-political, but it is, what do we think of the idea of alternative? Is it an alternative resistance, or is it sort of not a collectivity, but a collection of individuals? A confederation or something. So I'm thinking about those dimensions of Keller's work when I hear you talk about disaster capital in relation to piracy, Kavita. And then, we have Brewster's work, which is infrastructure building. And I know all of you are very deeply interested and invested in infrastructure too. And the Internet Archive is not micro-political at all. It is a big front door meant for millions and millions of people to walk through and find what they need and take what they need. So I don't think it's always, I don't know. I wonder what Brewster would say about the Internet Archive being alternative activism too. So yeah, I think this conversation could go in a bunch of directions. This is a panel on piracy and capitalism. So anybody want to say anything about capitalism? Yes, Brewster.
I'm not so good at the capitalist thing, but there's some of what you're talking about using the word activism. There's a question by Mark Stewart that I think is actually could be really an interesting one. I'll just read it. When we were looking at especially digital piracy, is this the term that we are best to use? It's understood broadly, but it suggests inherent illicitness, potentially an ethical position, which might often be questioned. I think that's exactly right. And I just wonder what it meant for the pirate party to actually gain seats in European Parliament. And is it trying to own the word? But actually, should we go the other way? Should we delegitimize those that use and cast the word piracy as a weapon, so that we've done this, now with racial epithets and other sort of national designation epithets. I think the term intellectual property was absolutely brilliant and hideously evil Just the term, just going and cramming those two words together, intellectual property, was wrong. Is going and using this, slinging this word piracy, does it actually lead to an enhancement of the conversation? I like your idea. Let's go with activism instead. And maybe that's a better description. Mute.
I love Jen's and Elisa's pointing out who are the pirates? Who really is doing all the stealing? You know, where is most of the theft originating from and against whom? So yeah, Ramon Lobato would say, you know, Ramon's invested in a lot of different words being used, but definitely not letting piracy be the only word. He says, let's use the word informal, like informal economies, rather than always making it about piracy and using that term pirate. So yeah, but I'm good with activism if you are, Brewster. That sounds interesting and good to me, to try to think about informal markets as activist markets. But I think we all know, those of us that do sort of interviewing work or ethnography based work, that, you know, many pirates do not conceive of their acts as activism or as political in any way, or even as anything beyond their own personal, not even like principles, but their own personal, just literally like, what do I want to watch tonight? You know, just like what is happening with them, even just in the moment. And I also think there's a whole realm of creativity, as, you know, as Brewster pointed out, as Elisa points out, that like the whole realm of fanish practices that yield remix, that yield collage-based work or found footage films, that these types of artworks also do not, some of them are very highly political, and for a lot of them, the copying is just the means of expression, or just the beginnings of the creative, you know, just the genesis of a kind of making, a kind of maker practice that artists are interested in. So I think that that's that dimension of the word activist, whereas some of us might embrace the political dimension. I think other people, practitioners, or just, and by that I just mean ordinary people that practice piracy on the day-to-day, might not, you know, might not feel that, might not resonate with them in the affective life of piracy for them. Any thoughts,
I think
Alex?
I just had a quick thought on sort of the vocabulary, which is one of the things I noticed in Brazil is that there was a kind of semantic warfare that was going on. There was a very, very conscious attempt to apply the term piracy to a much broader array of domains that had been applied to. So, you know, generic drugs, aftermarket auto parts, you know, cheaper printer cartridges. And this was a quite self-conscious effort. And so I refer to it as a kind of a semantic warfare. I just wanted to quickly, though, return to the subject of race. And one of the things that I noticed when I was looking at policing in particular was that racialized discourse emerged in particular around the materiality of the forbidden. And one of the many reasons I loved what Elisa did was that it really kept your work, I think, was, you started off saying you weren't going to talk about media piracy, but it was so centrally about media piracy for me, because it seems to me one of the sort of antinomies of contemporary capitalism is a difficulty mediating between the virtual and the material. And this is where a lot of the anxieties arise for me around what I was trying to talk about with cellularity. And so this is where this is just an observation, but this is where the racialized discourses were employed. This is where the dirt and the promiscuity and these other kinds of shaming languages were employed. And so, you know, Elisa, that was terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I also just wanted to just quickly sort of address the idea of the word. And to me, it reminds me a lot of the distinction between like informal and insurgent, right? And this is, maybe I'm like in anthropology territory, right? But like not everything that is informal is insurgent, right? And so I think that there's a way that piracy is one of those words that kind of, there isn't an inherent political orientation, right? It isn't all activism, I guess, maybe. But I do think that that's maybe a useful way of thinking about it. I think the sort of Pirates of the Caribbean, Johnny Depp, right, is not necessarily the same as sort of other people who take that up. So
I'm struck thinking about that by a kind of alliance, or just alliance of, or sympathy maybe, that could exist between looters, pirates, and people that just want to avoid data surveillance. I think about how people use social media to kind of just let people know where the looting's happening, and also to let them know where the pirated rips can be downloaded from. And people use VPNs to hide their pirate activity, and also to hide their data from corporations, or to mask it and make it not that usable, or not that fruitful for them. I think there's just overlaps in lots of strategies that people have developed in response to capital, Kavita, and in response to, I like your expansion of that term disaster capitalism to just talk about how capitalism for us all is a disaster. So in response to the disaster of capitalism, pirates, looters, activists, and just people interested in privacy or evading data capture are using similar techniques or similar platforms, or their questions are leading them down similar roads to similar practices and technologies. So there is a simpatico across those groups, even if it's unstated. Even if, as Keller would say, there's no manifesto, there's no club you can join where you say we're resisting capital today. But people do resist capital anyway. Each in their own way, each in the way that sort of is sensible and presents itself and apprehensible in the moment and meets their own needs too. So there's something interesting happening here with this potential agglomeration of terms and positionalities, I think. Okay, I'm kind of expecting any of you to now join in also. I also have some longish questions. One DM'd to me. So let me just pause and say I have a place to go if everybody wants to be quiet. But does anybody want to speak up?
I'll say a little something. Although I'm just overwhelmed with thinking, and I might be tongue-tied as a result. But one of the faculties that one sort of wants to develop is that ability to see somehow on a split screen that you're not just dealing with the label that's supposed to come with this organization, this temperament, and so on, because they're almost always decoupled. They're almost always at war with each other, and this faculty of being able to see the activity and the kind of composition of an organization apart from what it's doing or apart from its ideological label seems essential. It's a kind of like something that we as humans do but don't talk about. It's underexpressed, but it seems like a crucial faculty. It's a dog has this faculty. Better we have this faculty too, but don't sharpen it or keep it in play so that all those differences between and gradients of piracy or activism. But it's true that if you don't do that as an activist, capital will run rings around you, and the singular solution, the righteous vanguard, which is pure in its formation and so on, is pretty weak. Even though it does have the power to frighten us and make us conform also at times. I mean, I think it does. But it is extremely weak as an approach to activism. Not that there isn't a conviction about the reduction of violence and the increase of information, but it's being able to, but it seems like that is more available to us when you can see both the ideological label and what the organization is actually doing. And you know, they was slipped in there some way because I'm, you know, I work on space. I don't work on digital material, but when our digital organizations also are muddied with spatial components, that is so much stronger. I mean, I mentioned that Tor network, you know, but you know, when the Tor network had, you know, it was just in another kind of binary face-off, was being called a dark network and so on. The amazing way in which it was strengthened, in a kind of I am Spartacus moment, when it was strengthened by becoming a part of a network of nodes in New Hampshire libraries, it camouflaged itself by exposing itself. It camouflaged itself and got more strength by becoming physical. And I think there's something there, but it's something I would say, you know, because I work on space. Anyway, so it was a long ramble.
You're touching now on an interest I have in mesh nets, like the Athenian wireless network that sprang up in Athens after the crash, after the severe financial devastation of Greece, where Athenians, you know, built their own last mile, basically, from the fiber cable, and made sure there was internet in Athenian homes, and then, you know, would stream to each other downloaded movies. That was one of the main uses of the mesh net, was to keep each other entertained and make sure that there was still kind of a nightly broadcast of you know, pleasure and leisure-based media. And I think that network, I mean, I haven't checked in on it recently, but yeah, that spatial quality seems to have just normalized it. You know, it's not, is it illicit? It's like the official internet service provider of a lot of homes in Athens, you know? So I think that spatialization can do a lot. I know the Internet Archive has a building, and I know that's to house a lot of servers, but I'm sure there's also something about a literal brick and mortar front end that helps with certain, you know, discursive arguments. So yeah, thank you for that kind of, Lisa Parks would love that reference to the spatial dimensions of the internet. Okay, I'm gonna ask, anyone want to respond to that before I try to parse my graduate student's huge question that she just DM'd me? Yes, Elisa.
I would like to respond to something you said earlier, Gail, about this possible alliance. And you know, the first thing that comes to mind is Laura Harris's work on the Motley Crew and Marcus Rediger and Peter Linebaugh and sort of the many-headed Hydra, right? And that these are these kind of pirate-like sort of terms that I think really speak to other kinds of solidarity that are sort of cross-ethnic, cross-racial solidarity, that are not that are kind of not the sort of class-based solidarity that I think neoliberalism depends on for us. So I think those are maybe these phrases or terms that could be helpful for thinking about that. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, thank you so much. That definitely makes me think about how many of my interviewees have talked about piracy as a way that they have even entered the neoliberal middle class, because, you know, growing up without a lot of information, without a ton of access, the internet and book piracy is one way that young people can sort of get a great college prep education, and is maybe, you know, maybe not the only way, but it's definitely the easiest way. So I think there is something about people entering into that middle class, but then also how we use fandom and piracy, we use culture and information access as ways to find a commons together, or ways to build a commons together, common languages, common interests, common vocabularies. Yeah, definitely. Okay, Alex, were you making a gesture? Yes.
Yeah, it was totally an amorphous gesture. That is well put. I just wanted to briefly underscore, and we may be moving in this direction. And Kavitas did such a wonderful job of this. I keep saying last week, but it was 2 weeks ago. But I also noticed in Brewster's comments today, I think, and also Jennifer's comments, that one of the things that we're moving through is the cyclical nature of this, the kind of historically cyclical nature of this. And I just be honest and say this is a continual struggle for me, because I'm continually trying to ask, well, what is new? I'm doing this project with teenagers and cell phones right now in Washington, D.C. And they're both embroiled in the newness of it and pulled in these very deeply historical directions. And I'll just mention quickly that 2 summers ago, I tackled this wonderful new translation of Don Quixote. And you're going to ask me who the translator is, and I'm forgetting, but it's amazing. And there's this sequence of chapters right at the beginning where they're going through his library and burning the books because they have destroyed his brain. And of course, I'm living in this mediascape, so I think, well, this whole book is about print. That's what this whole book is about. It's how print destroyed someone's brain. And this was written some time ago. I mean, obviously I'm oversimplifying. It's a lot more than Quixote than that. But anyway, all I wanted to just do is underscore the kind of the deeplical. I was going to say cyclical and deep, but we'll do that instead. The deeplical nature of it.
Thank you. We'll add deeplical to our list of terms from tonight. Okay, I'm gonna ask Jacqueline, if you're around, unmute yourself, because this question you DM'd me is like 3 paragraphs long, and I will not be able to represent it adequately. So Jacqueline Joe, PhD student in performance studies at UC Berkeley, if you are there, unmute right now.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Ask your long question.
No, sorry for the huge word count of the question. Like, as a PhD student, I feel like I'm being trained in expressing simple thoughts in like a lot of words. So it is a lot of words for a relatively basic question. And I guess I'm just gonna mostly read what I DM'd Gail. But I guess I'll preface it by saying, like, COVID questions might kind of be low-hanging fruit at this point, but I ask this question not because of like, ooh, unprecedented times in general, but because one very real story we can tell about the pandemic is this story of media consumption, which was discussed at length in last week's Fandom panel, right? So I feel that there's something contradictory maybe about discourses surrounding media access in the past year, right? So on the one hand, we've seen media consumption be deemed necessary for survival, right? So media access is posited as something that literally saves lives and is literally a matter of public health and national security, right? And as a result, various paywalls have been lifted and blanket permissions for use have been given from entities like JSTOR on the one hand, and also like Pornhub, right? But on the other hand, we have, just in recent news, we have the lawsuit against Internet Archive, we have the death of Kiss Anime, which for over a decade was one of the most widely used anime streaming sites ever, and probably a large part of the reason that we have an American anime fandom at all. And in addition to the sort of standard Twitter anti-piracy hullabaloo from industry, but also from consumers. So I think it's interesting that even with increased access to media being seen as like a public service in a troubled time, piracy remains an exception to that. So I want to know if the panelists have takes on why right now, when the question of like, oh, what are you watching has become a bigger and more important question than ever, why does the pirate figure surface again super visibly as a target for critique?
Thank you, Jacqueline. Panelists?
I'd love to hear Brewster talk about the Internet Archive lawsuit.
Yeah.
Boy, am I advised not to do that. But just to correct the questioner on the JSTOR thing, yeah, there was this big hullabaloo after the New Yorker piece about, wouldn't it be great if JSTOR opened up? And then there's somebody said, they opened up. And then I contact Kevin Guthrie. He said, no, they completely misquoted me. No. So there was small things done, but they were really on the fringes by others. But yeah, it gets into the whole area of disinformation, right? Which we've just gone through 2 election cycles in the United States that are plagued with it. And, one aspect is to go and have good information, right? A cure to disinformation is make it so you have referenceable things that you can click on and go and read real stuff. And there's a current affairs had the editor use one of his issues, and he said, lies are free, the truth is paywalled, right? And it's just a plague. And we've just got a real problem out there that we're basically, now that we're all just living in these little yellow boxo land, our whole world is just media, and it's very heavily regulated, and the publishers are feeling extremely strong. They're going after, it's Rupert Murdoch on down. I mean, they own HarperCollins, right? That's the lead litigant against the Internet Archive, is Rupert Murdoch's empire. So we're seeing some strength, I think, in the growth of the corporation. That was one of those things in the late 60s and early 70s. We were, there's this big rallying cry around multinationals. And then it sort of died away, but I think it's as a something to be worried about. But it's gone and climbed. It's been a real problem. So how do we go and to deal with that? And this going and throwing this word around at people is, I think, a little dangerous, and it seeds too much of our public information lands.
Jen, do you want to talk about the, corporations?
Well, yeah, in all of this, I've been constantly thinking about the kind of unification of even the university with the corporation, and what's gone on during COVID, especially in terms of, my mania right now, which is about big tech as pirates. And one thing that I experienced firsthand in a way I don't, sometimes you get to live your research in a certain way. And I got to live my research by accidentally getting the faculty association. I don't know if we were sued, but we were majorly threatened by crazed lawyers of one of the remote testing corporations for speaking badly about them. And, they're basically, I'm thinking about it in terms of Keller's discussion of space and spatial politics and piracy, because in those, when a student is being surveilled as they're taking tests, if they dare to even look around in the space, let's say the space isn't their own and someone's walking through, they look and they're dinged for looking away for information. And it's so tyrannical and obscene that, we started a big stink at UCSB about it. But it's truly tragic for any kind of quality of education, and it positions you as having to be an activist just if you believe in, someone's freedom not to be surveilled. And again, their data is being pirated while they are taking an exam, just because they had to sign up for the service. And so I think the kind of unification of corporations with institutions of, state power is always hastened by disaster and trauma and that kind of thing. And we've watched it happen to a degree that is terrifying to me now during, this past year. Once you open a door like that, you can't close it. It's done. So everything that everybody has been saying has really been speaking to how I think about these issues. And I just really, I haven't been that talkative because I've been so enjoying listening to everybody speak. But yeah, I mean, there could be nothing worse than what we've got going on right now with the rise of neoliberal surveillance capitalism. We're kind of done for. I don't have like rosy, happy views on our future.
You don't believe in regulation, Jen? You don't think we're going to win?
Oh, I believe in regulation. I don't believe that, I have some serious hope that Lena Khan and Tim Wu were just put in positions of, at the FTC, and also Tim Wu's now an advisor. So that's really great news. But do I believe in everybody falling in line to regulate big tech the way it needs to be? No, they don't even know what it does, right? They are surprised to learn that the business model is mining data for advertisers. So I'm just like full of bad news these days.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Okay.
Good. We need that. Alex?
I just had a quick thought, which is that I wanted to share that I too watched The Social Dilemma and wanted to put my eyes out with a brooch at the end of the experience. Although I also think that one of the reasons I love the framing of fandom and piracy together is that one of my current struggles is that there are numerous kind of counter publics embedded within the internet that find not solace, but way more, that find the sort of constitution of their identities in these spaces that renders some of that, a little bit more problematic for me. But Jacqueline, I just wanted to also come back to your question and say what a fantastic question that is. And I think a book could be written in attempting to answer it. And I have just, I don't want to be patronizing in trying to answer it because I don't have an answer. But maybe one piece of it is I've heard a lot of, sort of ethnographically thinking about Zoom fatigue and people discussing two-dimensionality. And I wonder if there's something about the sort of mode of conveyance in which we find ourselves in face-to-face conversation, and then also in sort of public cultural consumption, if the sudden forcing of a confluence of those two things could be a little piece of the answer to that. But your question is so interesting that it ramifies in a whole lot of other directions too. So thank you for asking that. It's made me think a lot.
Nice. Okay. I don't know if, I guess Brewster cannot talk about the lawsuit, but in the chat, I'm going to put a link to a Google Drive folder I made earlier today, which contains a letter from the UC Berkeley Library Fund, which announces, first of all, I really love it when we get mail from Berkeley that says, "Dear Mr. and Professor DeKosnik." I just like that. And then it's a fundraising letter. And what it says is that, so let's keep in mind the Internet Archive is being sued over creating, as I understand it, over creating a kind of COVID era library for all, in which people can access free copies of books that the Internet Archive has purchased and digitized. They can access those digitizations online. And the UC Berkeley, and they're being sued for that. And then the UC Berkeley Library Fund sent this fundraising letter to us that says, through its new e-reserves program, meaning in this time, in this COVID-19 pandemic, this new e-reserves program that it has established, the library is purchasing digital versions and digitizing physical versions of course materials so they can be accessed from anywhere. This past fall 2020, the library provided free digital course materials for 401 classes in 91 departments with a total enrollment of 20,000 501 students. And so, you know, and Benjamin, my husband, gave me this letter today to bring up tonight. And I guess one of Benjamin's questions is, what is the difference? What is the difference between a university library digitizing books and making them available to more than 20,000 people, and the Internet Archive digitizing books and making them available to Internet Archive users? So I will just
So as I understand the claims in the lawsuit, they went and said, oh, we're only going to sue you. Though Hati Trust is doing controlled digital lending, which we invented 9 years ago. We've been doing this for 9 years, where we buy books and digitize them for the blind and dyslexic, and then from there we make available for machine learning type activities, and then limited controlled lending. And it's been going on for, well, 9 years. There are 80 libraries that have all been doing this, but they said, okay, we're going to sue you. And we are going to say you're not a library. And you have to destroy 2 million books. So you have to go and burn 2 million books. And there's another book that I've been listening to the audio version of. It's calling Burning the Books. And it's by this Oxford scholar of the tradition of who burns libraries and how do they get burned. And it's usually by the powerful, of course. It was either the church or the monarchs. And now I'd say it might be the corporations or the new power in town that are trying to burn libraries. And so this is, these are, and the key thing is we've been trying to buy ebooks. We buy, and if it's a modern book, might as well buy the ebook. They won't sell them. That the big guys will not sell them. But the indie publishers are starting to sell, like PM Press in Oakland. Awesome guys. They just sold us every one of their books. And so, you know what the transaction was like? We gave them money, they gave us bits. Woo! Right? And so we can preserve that, we can lend it. I mean, it's kind of, but the idea of copyright is not strong enough for these large corporations. They want to license the things. And so you never get to actually own anything. So digital ownership, I would say, is something that we need your guys in academia, some help. I mean, it gets all around this sort of like, if you write your own works and you've sold it away to a publisher, can you even post it on your website? I mean, all of that stuff. But the idea of digital ownership, if we don't have digital ownership, we can't have small players. If you have to be plugged into a platform to be able to distribute your work, you're owned. And so digital ownership is the way out. There's Maryland just passed a law trying to force Amazon into dealing with libraries and not denying libraries the books that they're publishing, that they're the imprint of. They have to do reasonable terms, but it's still with this understanding it's probably still going to be licensed. But, so there's a DPLA is trying to become the exclusive licensor of Amazon books on behalf of libraries. And it's the wrong thing. We're going down the wrong path. Just sell the books, sell books. And we won this originally with the music guys, where you could actually go and buy MP3s eventually. It didn't have to come in this whole DRM'd cradola world. And that was Steve Jobs facing down the music publishers. And after a lot of artists rose up. So I think there, the Authors Alliance out of Berkeley has a lot of authors that are not well served by the big publishing contract platform play. Just don't distinguish that far big tech from the big content guys. That is they're more similar. And the idea of somebody noted in the chat that Rupert Murdoch is going after Facebook to do a deal on link taxes and the like. And that's going to be that sort of oligarchy kind of structure, and the middle and the small guys are going to be completely left out. So if we want a level playing field where small players or a game with many winners, let's go with digital ownership, where you sell things. And then it's ruled by law. And you can't necessarily just go and put it out on the internet. You might, the library, you have to lend it, or you just use it for private use. You may be able to give it to one person. rule of law. I'm kind of a believer in that as opposed to rule of license. Sorry, you got me going.
I'm glad to get you going. Okay, we are almost at the end of our time. I'll just say quickly, because it's so pressing, I think, Brewster, what happened when the lawsuit was announced was that a lot of authors, it's not just big content and it's not just big tech, it's individual authors who understand the Internet Archive as a pirate site, or who just assume that digitized means piracy. And there's a lot, there was a conversation on social media last week about the 30-year copyright, and author after author after author decrying the 30-year copyright. You know, how are my children going to eat? If I am not a best-selling author in 30 years, my children are going to starve. And, you know, like the one or two copyright or publishing scholars that come in and say, actually, you know, the way it was you could renew your copyright. You just have to send in a form to the copy registration office that says, you know, you still want the copyright and pay a small fee, but like 30-year copyright doesn't mean what you think it means. But I think there is a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding, especially among people who are taught that IP protection, high protectionism is the only way they can possibly live on this earth. The only way that they can feed themselves and their families is by having a similar disposition, as Easterling would say, towards ownership and IP rights and protectionism as corporations do. Like, each of us has to be our own corporation and fight and protect, you know, our rights and be copyright maximalists. Each of us has to do that, this discourse tells us, not just big content, but, you know, we have to do that work also. I think there is that misunderstanding too. I see these kinds of pushbacks on social media all the time about digitization and sharing and piracy being thrown around as the label for that. Okay, last remark.
Paid disinformation.
Paid disinformation. I like that. Okay, last remarks. Who wants it? Kavita, take it away.
I think that I want to go back to Alex's opening and Elisa's ending with, you know, Jennifer and Keller and Brewster reminding us what's at stake. I want to caution us about thinking about this both very locally and very globally, because one often comes across discussions about a kind of free, a nostalgic free past, which is often the past of liberalism, the past that the Cold War and a kind of neo-colonial imperial domination of the world afforded Western liberal consumers. If you look at kind of the ways in which even activists, and this is why I was gesturing towards Keller's warning about what kinds of activism we pursue, activists look back at a rosy time when we could get everything, when often, I mean, I grew up in India during the Cold War and we didn't have Western music or Western books. But of course, this was the Cold War. That was the other side. I could get very, very cheap Soviet books. I read lots of Soviet literature. I bought it for pennies on the street because the Soviets would flood our markets with mere publications. I still remember the texture of the paper. And so we're always in a kind of Cold War nostalgia when we talk about where we were in that period. And I also want to, I'm really moved by Elisa's recounting of the enslaved bodies in the hold and the possibility of pirating oneself. And I think often Western consumers are worried about the decline into corporate domination because white neoliberal consumers have never experienced what it is to be in the hold. And the kind of prospect of a neoliberal primitive accumulation that threatens to push even white Western consumers into the hold, in which monopolies raise an increasingly small percentage of people who can be at the top of this new corporate pyramid, where all we have to sell is ourselves. We are in the hold. And I think in the terror, in the moral panic around it is also a moral panic about being made Black and made third world. And I think those of us who do speak from third world histories, from Black embodied histories, are aware not only of offering our modes of resistance for a kind of salvific narrative of the future, but the ways in which a white Western liberal subject has always consumed not only the enslavement and the indenturing of Black and brown bodies, but also the resistant and salvational narratives that we write for ourselves.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kavita. Thank you, everybody, all our amazing panelists, our staff, our students who worked on this, all our audience for coming. Many, many thanks. And this will be up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Gail.
Thanks to you. Thank you so much for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gail.